Yeah, but I suppose it's like I was saying, you've that great quality of I've obviously followed your Twitter for a while, but I can't predict your opinions really on different things, which I think is quite an interesting trait for someone to have, that you don't go into any one bucket necessarily. It's very much kind of an independent thought process.
Well, I think when I look around at the internet in particular, and how much the internet has kind of grown into a forum for thought leadership over the last decade or so, the biggest single pitfall I see people falling into, and you could argue whether it's a pitfall or not, because some of them are very, very successful, and that is being audience captured. So, and I see it over and over again where somebody grows their audience to a certain point, maybe starts to monetize it a little bit, but then it's like Yoda said in Star Wars: "All who gain power fear to lose it." Right? So they start then shaping their opinions to what they think the audience wants to hear, and I think that's a very dangerous road to go down, both for the audience and for the person who's in that position. For the audience, because you can't really trust anymore that you are hearing somebody giving you their independent opinions as opposed to pandering to you, and for the influencer, for want of a better term, though I hate that term, because you actually start to lose any influence or control or ability to shape your own audience's opinions because you're just feeding them back what they want to hear. And I think it's corrosive on a wider level in society as well because it deepens polarization. I mean, the other thing is I think it's so important to do this and try and be a normal person. Like to yeah, yeah, I'm a conservative. Yeah, I object to a lot of stuff that's happening culturally, but that doesn't mean I can't sit down and watch a TV show that's very popular with people who are liberals, or it doesn't mean I can't like be a sports nut or any of those things. I think it's very important to maintain being the person that you are and to just be yourself and not be afraid of pissing people off. I mean, I piss people off all the time who agree with me on 90% of the issues. But I think if you're not afraid to piss them off, if you're afraid of losing them, then you're of no value to them. And I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, "Look, if you agree with me on 70% of the issues, then vote for me. But if you find yourself agreeing with somebody on 100% of the issues, check yourself into an asylum because you're not thinking for yourself anymore." And I think that's a really important thing for people to bear in mind. I mean, if you know, even in a marriage, if you're not disagreeing with your wife half the time, there's something strange going on, I think.
For certain. Do you feel, was that one of the reasons for beginning with Gript, where you wanted someone that was independent, where, let's say, even for a lot of the people who write for you, you're not gonna agree with probably a lot of things that they say as well, but you still would like them to have that platform and write about things that you might have some objection to,
Yeah,
but you're
I
like, yeah, I
mean,
can see your argument there.
look,
That does make sense on one level to a different kind of person.
yeah, I mean, firstly, yeah, I wouldn't be doing my job as an editor if I just published things I agreed with. I've got to publish things I disagree with. Which and look, Ben Scallon is great. He counts for about half of that content. I'm joking, but only a little bit. Ben and I obviously disagree on lots of things. We are certainly have different emphasis on opinions on certain things. But I think the reason we started Gript was because I think in Ireland in particular, we're a very consensus based society. That you will not find major disagreement within the sort of mainstream media on many topics, for good or for ill. And a lot of the times they will agree and they'll be correct to agree. But I think if you look back over the recent history of Ireland, and I use the 2008 recession as a good example of that. There was huge consensus going into that the country was on the right track, that we'd have a soft landing, that there'd be no massive economic turmoil. And then when it happened, it was a huge psychological shock because not only were we wrong, but we were all wrong together. I think in any conversation, room for dissent is vital. And I find it very ironic that when you look back at the history of Ireland through the various eras, that kind of tolerance for dissent is something we've never been good at. I mean, people who are progressives in Ireland today look back at the Ireland of John Charles McQuaid and say, "Look, our opinions were suppressed, our voice was shut down." They're they're not as right as they think they are, but they have a very good point. And I therefore think it's sort of ironic that we live in an Ireland today where that is also often, sadly, the case, that dissenting opinions are kind of regarded as sort of pathological, that there's something wrong with you if you believe, for example, most of the same things that Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach of the country, would have believed in 2008. So like, yeah, I think in any sort of working or thinking society, a panoply of opinions that are tolerated and listened to carefully by all sides are really, really important. And that includes people who are liberals. And I always say to anyone who's on sort of the right side of politics or where I am, find yourself somebody who you really disagree with. follow them on social media, listen to what they say, try to understand where they're coming from, because I think that's absolutely vital. So I think it's really important to read newspapers you disagree with, and to listen to opinions, or listen to podcasts you don't agree with, and understand that the people making those arguments are reasonable people making them from a good place most of the time. If you can do that, you'll be smarter as a result.
100%. Yeah, I think that's actually one thing now that you brought it up. Let's say, certain things we might see going on in Ireland, like let's say hate speech laws coming into effect, and us thinking that potentially this is something that's very new. But censorship has actually always been there throughout the history of the state in some respects. Like where we look at, like you brought up John Charles McQuaid there, I
Mhm.
think he's quite an interesting character to look at throughout history. But it wasn't like this has always been this sort of free speech oriented society that's based on this sort of on Fifth Amendment
Mhm.
rights, like the United States or anything like that. We've kind of had this history a lot of the time where the state does have this air quotes correcting sort of I suppose effort on things that the people may say. It's not
Mhm.
exactly a new departure, I wouldn't say, with hate speech.
It's
I think that the specific manifestation is a bit different, but
It's funny, the Irish Constitution actually doesn't guarantee the right to free speech. It guarantees the right of free expression subject to the strictures of public order and morality. So the government has always had the constitutional right, in some form or other, to restrict speech. And of course, that was designed, ironically enough, to suppress things like pornography. That was the purpose of it. That's why our constitution has subject to public order and morality, because back when the constitution was drafted, we were still a country that prided ourselves on our sort of faith and fidelity, and there was huge concern about people corrupting the public morals. So we had censorship. I mean, I think Playboy magazine was only unbanned in Ireland in about 1995. There's particularly around sexual morality, there were always huge restrictions on speech and things that you could say and so on. So I mean, I think it does have to be put into that historical context, that restrictions on speech in Ireland are not some new thing that have been imposed upon us from abroad. There has always been this instinct in the Irish psyche, particularly by those who are sort of the dominant force in society, whoever they may be, whether it was the British, by the way, or whether it was the Gaelic chieftains before them, to kind of suppress and tamp down anything that might rock the boat. We're a don't rock the boat society, and have always been. And I think the fear of speech has always been the not the things that are being said, but the fear that people might agree with them. And that governs all restrictions on speech. They're not afraid of what you say. They're afraid of the people who are listening to you, who might go, I never thought about it like that before, or that guy has a point, which might then destabilize a society. Um, so yeah, I think when you look at the hate speech bill, which is obviously a horrendous and terrible piece of legislation, it's not. I sometimes hear people saying, "Oh, this is sort of a global agenda, or it's being imposed from outside." I don't think so. I don't think you can believe that and really understand this Irish society of ours that we've grown up with. I think there's always been, from the pulpit to the political, to the media, there has always been an instinct just to take the sort of troublemakers and tell them to shut up and stay in the corner and stay quiet. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from.
completely agree. I would absolutely agree. I think there, yeah, like what was this? I read a great book. I'd actually recommend this to you. It's called Empire of Nothing. And it's basically about it's basically the whole cliff note of the book is don't attribute to malice or
Mm.
conspiracy what you can attribute to just simple incentives and just the way the system is set up. That's you could potentially not read the book because I'm sure it's probably not the first time you've been exposed to that idea. But the I think one of your interesting predictions from one of your articles I read recently was kind of going through some of your predictions for 2024. You had these globally, you had these in Ireland as well. Like some of they were spread out across the world, but definitely it kind of felt like the year in a way where not so much like the cat was out of the bag in a sense, but definitely where you see, I think not so much people rocking the boat, but definitely people not fully falling in line where people are saying, right, I don't think we like massively agree 100% with everything that the government is looking at, or the government kind of would purport about some of the issues going on in Ireland. I think one of the predictions you had there, which you just touched on, was that the hate speech bill is a piece of legislation that you're not a fan of, that I wouldn't be a fan of either. And you were kind of saying that it won't pass. I'd be interested to go into why you think that will be so.
Mm. It's an interesting one, and I might, of course, be wrong. I've not got a perfect record of predicting things, but I think for anyone who's outside of Ireland listening to this, it's important to understand that this is much like the United States and a lot of other countries around the world. It's a big year for elections in Ireland. We have local and European elections, and we are likely to have a general election before the end of the year. If not before the end of this year, then very early by law, we must have it next year. And we have a government that is under political pressure on a range of fronts in terms of the supply of housing. There's a wide perception in the country that crime is out of control. There has been, like a lot of other Western countries, a significant pressures on the cost of living, huge fuel price increases, heating increases, electricity increases, and an opposition that is, very close to being in pole position to win the next election. And therefore, I think it becomes a question of how you use your political capital in the run into those elections. In Ireland, we have seen it is very unusual, and I think this has to be, can't be underlined enough how different we are from other democracies in how unusual it is for members of the governing party to break with the government. So obviously, if you look at the UK or Australia or most other Westminster model democracies, it's very common for there to be rebellions on the government side. If you look at the US Congress, very common for there to be rebellions. In Ireland, it almost never happens. And what we have seen with the hate speech bill is actually a brewing rebellion. We've had one of the government leaders in the Senate, which is our upper house, basically saying she can't support it in its current form. We've had multiple TDs who voted for it at one point now saying they're reconsidering voting for it on the government side. And we've also had the main opposition party, which assented to its initial passage through the first stage of the legislation, now signalling effectively that they can't vote for it either. All of which has driven the political cost of pushing this thing through up dramatically. And when you add to that it is not a piece of legislation with what you could call broad popular support, it's not an economic piece of legislation. It doesn't give people any money. It doesn't reduce their taxes. It doesn't put money in their pockets. It takes away something from the public. It takes away rights. And its most enthusiastic supporters tend to be journalists, people working in sort of NGOs and lobby groups around hate and the rise of the far right and so on. It doesn't have a particularly electorally strong support base either. So I think it's one of those ones where when I say it won't pass, I don't mean that the government will turn around one day and say, right, we're dropping this idea. I think it will die a slow death of delay until we get to a general election, and then it might be brought back. I think the political costs, or perhaps to be more precise, the political opportunity costs of spending a month or a month and a half trying to ram this thing through when you can be focused on things that are more electorally relevant to the survival of your own backbenchers and local councillors. I would be surprised if the government invested that time. I might be entirely wrong. Maybe they will do it, but if they do it, I think it would be deeply unwise, which is why I'm predicting that they might make one sensible decision this year.
One sensible decision this year for sure. Yeah, I think one other prediction which I think does play into that, which is that there is an opposition which could be in pole position to potentially usurp the coalition that we have now. I think one that's kind of gaining popularity and that is potentially a bit malleable, in terms of their opinions with previous opinions that they may have had, is of course Sinn Féin. And I think that was one of the predictions where you made, which you kind of said, well, this is already slightly began, where they've kind of began to go to the right a little bit in terms of their policy on immigration. In terms of the political decision for them to do that, do you see them like massively changing their stance there? Do you think it'll be a slow and gradual process? I wonder how Sinn Féin will kind of play things this year in that respect.
They're in a very interesting position, because again, if you look across the Western world at sort of other democracies in a comparable position, Sinn Féin are actually, and Irish people don't often think about it like this because we don't see other democracies, but they're actually quite a weak opposition electorally heading into the election. We have a government that is deeply unpopular. All the polling suggests its approval ratings are in the 20s, 30s at most. And this is a main opposition party that hasn't really cracked 33% of the vote. If you look, the UK Labour Party, for example, sitting on 47, 48% of the vote in some polls. There's a huge comparison. There's a huge contrast. And I think one of the reasons for that is that Sinn Féin have what you might call a middle class ceiling that they've yet to crack. And that is obviously that there are a lot of voters out there, and you see it in some of the focus grouping that I've seen that some parties have conducted, and they brief you on it and so on, one of the problems they have is that there are a lot of votes that are sitting with the government because they don't want to take that step of voting for Sinn Féin yet. A lot of sort of middle class votes, South Dublin votes, affluent constituencies where people don't want to vote for Sinn Féin because they believe it will be an endorsement of the provisional IRA campaign. That doesn't matter to maybe 40% of the electorate, but there's a big chunk of people to whom it still matters, which is artificially propping the government up a little bit. Now, Sinn Féin need to grow their vote in order to get into government, and it seems to me that their opportunities to grow their vote on the left have kind of run out of road. There's very little left-wing vote still for them to cannibalise. I mean, the Labour Party, which was the traditional Irish party of the left, has been decimated and may lose all its seats. The Green Party is in government at the moment and is on course to lose a lot of seats. That leaves two options: the Social Democrats, who are sitting on about 3 or 4%, and People Before Profit, who are the ultra hard left, whose votes aren't going anywhere because if you're voting for them, there's no alternative pure enough. So Sinn Féin's opportunity to grow the vote on the left has kind of shrunk, which means where is there a pool of votes that Sinn Féin can pull from to bring them from that 30-odd% up to closer to 40%? The answer is it's sitting with a lot of independent TDs and independent candidates who have been very vocal on this immigration issue, particularly at a local level. And so I thought, in terms of my prediction maybe coming true, I thought it was very interesting in Roscrea over the weekend, in County Tipperary, where there is a big local immigration issue. It was one of their TDs, Martin Brown, who was standing on the back of a lorry saying, "Look, we've been really hard done by this immigration issue, and the town has been abused and brutalised, and we need a fairer deal." And that is. That is a departure. That is Sinn Féin TDs, MPs, for those who aren't familiar with the term, standing up and saying, we think immigration is an issue. So I think that pivot has already begun to happen. Now, what's interesting is it's starting to happen. It's happening much more at a local level than a national level. And Sinn Féin seem to be trying to play this game where if they're giving interviews in a national newspaper or on a national broadcaster, they will sound much more cosmopolitan and liberal and warm and open to immigration and skeptical of sort of anti-immigration sentiment. That's when they're talking to sort of ABC1, upper class, affluent voters. And then at the much more local level, when they're knocking on doors, when they're talking to local radio, when they're in constituencies where this is an issue, they're playing the, "oh, well, we're being treated unfairly" card. So I think there is a shift underway. How far that goes, I don't know. I think there is a deep body of sort of what you might call progressive opinion in Sinn Féin that would rebel if it were to go too far. But I think they're definitely shifting a little bit. And I think we'll continue as an election approaches to do that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, almost barbell strategy in a way. It's almost like someone putting a bit of their net worth into some useless crypto coins and then most of it into the stock market, with very stable plays. It's an interesting barbell sort of approach. It's also interesting how different things haven't taken off in Ireland massively. We've never had a big socialist party or anything like that. I wonder, is that from being a very agrarian society where farmers, being the only people with guns, are kind of like, you want to take all of our land and do all this? No, no, thank you. And then with maybe Sinn Féin struggling to get more of that kind of vote we're talking about, is because we have such a big independent kind of I suppose assortment of TDs as well. I'd kind of it's a bit unique, I suppose, maybe to other European countries throughout antiquity. But
yeah, I think in relation to a couple of things you said there, I mean, we've never had a socialist government, and I struggle to believe that we ever will have one, because one of the things about Ireland, of course, is that property is psychologically so important to us. I mean, if you look back at our history before the War of Independence, where you had things like the Land War and you had the spectre of evictions and people being thrown off their land, the idea of owning your own little piece of the soil is so deeply and psychologically ingrained in Irish people that kind of collectivization was never a runner. And even in our constitution today, I mentioned that a lot of our rights are caveated. The one that's not, the one that is the most sort of strictly protected in the constitution, is the right to private property and the ownership of property, which is almost impossible to regulate or abrogate, which is why some people on the left now want a referendum on housing to change that, to make it more, to weaken that a little bit so they can fix what they say are the housing problems. So that kind of collectivization process has never been, and I think never will be, a runner in Ireland. But at the same time, we've never embraced sort of what you might call a sort of Friedmanite economic model either. We have always been, I think Ireland has always been run along the lines of sort of old school New Deal Democrat kind of policies. That's always been where the majority of the country has landed. Sort of strong social transfers from industry to kind of the lower middle classes, small farmers, small businesses, the unemployed. And I think that's actually probably still where the psychological soul of the country is when it comes to politics. And what's interesting is that very few people are offering that explicitly now. There has been a movement towards liberalisation as a result of EU membership, um, and at the same time, on the left, there's still that commitment to collectivization, which isn't popular. So really, what you're seeing is sort of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who used to be the two traditional big parties of sort of the Irish centre ground, have lost a huge swathe of their votes. And those are now parked in sort of that independent pile. And it's telling that a lot of the independents who are sitting in the Oireachtas are former members of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. People like Matty McGrath or Michael Collins, or you name it. That's where they draw their votes from. That's where, and they are the one sort of set of people who you might say still espouse that kind of, I'm going to call it New Deal politics for the sake of, it's not an exact transcription, but like that's what essentially it is, a sort of moderate social democracy, 1930s, 1940s style.
Yeah, I saw Matty at the just at the event in Roscoe over the weekend. He'd be my local TD there in South Tip. So yeah, definitely interesting. Yeah, I remember he was of that origin for sure. So one other prediction, which I think does relate to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. I don't keep mirroring your predictions because humans we struggle with prediction, or at least predicting surprises, like which almost, at least in an economic sense, seem to be all that matter in the long run. At least in terms of the markets, the surprises are really the things we can't predict, and of course, the things that catch us out. So there, one thing was either Micheál Martin or Leo Varadkar will be knocked off their perch. It's hard to say which one, I'm sure, because they're almost in this, at least as far as I can see with my level of understanding, this kind of strange interchangeable kind of dynamic in a way, at least throughout the last couple of years. So it's kind of a bit of a blurred line between the two. With that, would you have any leaning which way of who you think may be in a little bit more of a fragile position, in 2024?
Yeah, I think if you want to ask me who's more fragile of the two, I think it's Mr. Varadkar. On the purely rationalized basis that there are probably 3 or 4 people sitting behind him who make plausible replacements for him, and Fianna Fáil, by contrast, have almost nobody sitting behind Micheál Martin who's a plausible replacement for him. But I think what's interesting about those two men and sort of the dynamic they have with the country, and I was talking to somebody recently enough who made this point, and I thought it was a really good point, is that they have this strange arrangement, which is almost unheard of in a Western democracy, where they're rotating the office of the Taoiseach or the office of the Prime Minister between them. So one gets it for 2 years, the other gets it for 2 years, and then they might switch it back if they stay in power after the next election and so on. And what that's done has been kind of create a situation of impermanence and a sense that no one really has ultimate authority in the country. Because if you don't like one of them, you wait them out, and then the next person comes in, and there's no sense that there's anybody who's the actual boss. And I think that's hurting both of them. And I also think that they are both reaching a stage in their careers where they've been around for so long that it's very hard for them to kind of escape the mounting pile of blame that's laying on their doorsteps for everything, ranging from the state of the health service to the fact that pensions aren't going up fast enough for some people, to the bigger issues like immigration, law and order, and the economy. And I think the other thing is, as I said at the beginning of this conversation in relation to another prediction, we have a general election coming up at the end of this year, and we're going to get very panicky backbenchers thinking, what can we do to save our seats? And the simplest answer to that is we can replace our leader. And I think Leo Varadkar in particular is at real risk of people in Fine Gael looking around at somebody like Simon Harris or even somebody like Heather Humphreys as a safe pair of hands and saying, I think more people will vote for them than him. So yeah, that when I say that's a prediction, I'm what I more mean by prediction is that it wouldn't be a surprise to me if it were to happen, and I think it's something that is quite possible to happen. Obviously, when you're writing an article saying predictions, you can't issue that level of nuance. So don't hold me to it if it doesn't happen, but I think it's something we should be on the lookout for, put it that way.
Definitely, yeah. And I think there, if you're looking at predictions as well, just for anyone listening, it's like on a balance of probabilities. Like, let's say you were to predict something happening and it has a 70% probability. Well, it still has a 30% probability of not happening, and that eventuality could play out. But you actually kind of predicted correctly in a sense. So we're gonna have you be perfectly hedged that way, John, for the listener.
Yeah, I remember poor old Nate Silver after the 2016 US election got in awful trouble because I think he had predicted that Hillary Clinton was something like 70% likely to win a week or so beforehand. And he kept on trying to tell people that that means she wins in 70% of the simulations, but Donald Trump wins 30% of the time, which is fairly high chance. So yeah, that's the trouble with predictions.
Definitely, definitely. And I suppose with the last little while, I think, um, I suppose Varadkar, if Mr. Varadkar more so than Mr. Martin has kind of been I suppose the authority. Like obviously the line there is a bit blurred, but with him in the last while, there definitely seems to be a scenario of him being quite out of touch with what a lot of people might feel. In the country, I think I saw you posted in the Sunday Independent poll. This is from the 7th of January. I think it was 25% of people said the number one issue facing the country was immigration,
Mm,
and I think 13% said it was the rise of the far right. So
mm,
they're, I suppose, not worlds apart from one another. But I saw another article there shared in News Talk just about kind of the asylum situation of how a lot of people are arriving through the north, a lot of them without passports, um, you know, for whatever reason, um, and even some asylum seekers have worked in other EU countries, and so working in a country and then coming here and then claiming asylum seems to be kind of an interesting kind of claim to make. Would you say that maybe a big factor in Mr. Varadkar's potential vulnerability this year, or fragility, is that there definitely seems to be kind of this hugely like tone deaf kind of string of decisions where it's very out of touch with what the average Irish person might believe? That to me would seem potentially uh, like quite a source of fragility in a way, where people are like, "Jeez, is this guy listening to us at all?"
Yeah, I would put it another way. And by the way, your audio dropped for a second there, Connor, when you were asking that question. So if I don't address what you're saying, because I didn't hear all of it, but I think I got the gist of what you were asking. Um, I would put it another way. I don't think it's so much that he's out of touch, so much as that he's in touch with a particular current of opinion that is a minority, and he doesn't realize that it's a minority. Leo Varadkar, on a personal level, is a very interesting character study and sort of evolution of a politician because when he was before he was ever elected at all, he was a prolific letter writer to the Irish Times. And then as a councillor, and he built this reputation as sort of somebody who was certainly an economic and sort of maybe not on all cultural issues, but certainly on sort of economics, law and order, all that sort of stuff. Somebody who was potentially the most right wing politician Ireland had ever had, to the extent that he was legitimately feared by the left when he started to rise through the ranks and became a cabinet minister and then became the Taoiseach of the country. There was genuine concern that he was going to be a sort of Irish answer to Margaret Thatcher. And then, sort of around about 2010, 2011, 2012, he began to shift, and he began to shift radically. He came out as a gay man, which was undoubtedly a very courageous thing to do, but also seemed to coincide with a significant shift in his sort of political values. And he has been drifting leftward ever since. And I don't think it's fair to say that he's out of touch with the country, but he is very much in touch with sort of what I would call um, sort of it's a cliche, but sort of Dublin academic dinner party opinion. He is perfectly in touch with what they believe in the Trinity College Law Department or the UCD Politics Department or in the Irish Times newsroom, for example. He's perfectly in touch with sort of what polite opinion might be in Dublin's well-known gay bars. That is not in any way a homophobic comment. That is just where he socializes. I think he is somebody who is very much in touch with a sector of opinion that reflects his particular slice of society and where he is now. And I think the difficulty for him is that for most of the last decade, that was good enough because we had a country that was becoming more progressive and more liberal, and where there was a definite sense of we need to undo some of the stuff that's been biting us for years. So the ban on abortion had to go. We had to modernize our definition of marriage. We had to reform laws around adoption and surrogacy and have investigations into mother and baby homes and all that sort of stuff. So being in that kind of opinion was absolutely fine when that opinion was ascendant. I think the difficulty for him is, and I mean this genuinely, is that he doesn't have much contact with the views that are outside that particular sphere of opinion. And so when the opinion of the country is kind of changing or the mood in the country is changing, he's been a little bit insulated. And so it's taking him by surprise. And so on the issue, I mean, the immigration issue is obviously the issue that's really biting at the moment. But I think he genuinely has taken an awful long time to realize that this is an issue for a lot of people, because I think he's been surrounded by people who've been telling him, oh no, that's just a fringe, that's a minority, they're allowed, but no one votes for them, no one cares about them, no one agrees with them. And I think that has caused him to sort of have a very delayed reaction. And I think it's something that happens to politicians when they're in office too long. I mean, he's been consistently in government for a decade, and eventually you spend so much time with civil servants and so much time with advisors, and an increasingly smaller amount of time with the public, that your sort of political instincts start to get dulled, and you don't spend as much time talking to the ordinary person or people who will tell you that you're wrong as well. Deference starts to become a big thing. I mean, it's literally yes, minister, or yes, Taoiseach, all the time. That's what you're hearing. So there are very few people around you who will tell you, no, you're completely wrong on this, and the public are turning on you for it. So I think that's what I say when I mean say he's out of touch. I think that's what I mean. I think he's become an increasingly sort of isolated is the wrong word, but insulated is probably a better word. An insulated figure who is kind of not hearing all the advice he needs to be hearing if he wants to have a sense of where his country's at.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it's a very interesting formulation, and I think as well it's almost another, I suppose, manifestation of that idea of not necessarily attributing to malice what you can attribute to more readily available things. Like there, I wouldn't, because you can tell by my doubt he's I doubt he's a very mean spirited person or anything like that. Even the way he speaks, like you can, I think somewhat get a sense, at least from from the way someone speaks himself. I mean, all aren't they seem like decent people, of course, but I think it's probably more, like you're saying, probably more attributed to, yeah, like maybe a little bit of insulation there of kind of not being able to kind of see far and wide what the opinions of like many different people up and down the country would kind of think. I'd say that's probably more readily available, way of attribution.
Yeah, I think one thing to say here is that this is where, and obviously people who read my work will know that I'm a relentless critic of sort of state-funded NGOs and lobby groups and charities. And I think this is where they have done an awful lot of harm actually to the body politic, because the state has so many of these organizations now on the payroll, from people campaigning for restrictions on alcohol to people campaigning for the rights of single mothers to people campaigning for travelers' rights, or you name it, there's an organization lobbying for it. And one of the things that's happened is that kind of professionalized political representation for all sorts of people is actually all dominated by the same sort of social class. So we've had this massive increase in university take up since we made third level education free in the middle 90s. We have a spate of graduates coming out of universities with sort of degrees in English, or I mean, I'm not arts degrees, basically, sociology. I'm one myself, so this isn't a critic. I mean, I've got an economics degree for whatever it's worth, which isn't much. And there are lots of people like me who kind of end up going into not going into economics or arts or English. They go into sort of like advocacy and charity sectors, and so we've got this huge swathe of the economy and civil society, which is dominated by sort of a professionalized campaigning sector full of people who share mostly the same opinions because they all come from the same sort of academic background. So in many cases, the farmers are represented by people with the same opinions as the truck drivers or the single mothers or the travelers. It's professionalized, and so the entire political class has built this kind of infrastructure where there's very little diversity of opinion, even amongst all the different sectors of society who are supposedly on paper competing for the government's attention. And these are the people who the government are meeting every day when they're meeting people to talk about, oh, I don't know, disability issues. They're meeting people with broadly the same political outlook as the people they're meeting tomorrow to talk about, treatment for a particular medical condition in the health service. These people are all kind of represented by the same professionalized political class, which sort of promotes homogeneity, first of all, but second, kind of reduces the space for kind of characters and organic generation of ideas in the broader body politic. And a lot of sort of legislation has been outsourced to these groups. A lot of the sort of policy making agenda has been outsourced to these groups. And politicians have allowed themselves to become sort of captured by, what in the US they would call the symptoms of elite overproduction. Too many graduates, not enough for them to do, constantly expanding sort of third sector. And at the same time, ironically enough, we don't have enough young people in society to build the homes that we need to accommodate our population. So that's I think that is, if you ask me for a central thesis of what's wrong with Ireland, I think that's where it is. that's the sort of central thing that needs to be unwound. Though I really don't know how it can be without causing huge pain to a lot of people who are now working in those sectors.
Yeah, man, that's a very interesting point. I suppose though this is something that Nassim Taleb would talk about a lot. I don't know if you're a big fan of his books, but this idea of top down versus bottom up, and kind of, let's say,
Mm.
top down would be just this very theory first, doing second, and bottom up being, basically through what you would have had in the past of guilds, learning through apprenticeship, and kind of learning kind of in a what do you say, in a epistemological way. I
Mhm.
believe that's the term. Basically, learning through experience. I believe that's epistemology, and we don't really have that as such anymore. And you actually get a few interesting phenomena where, let's say, Taleb calls this lecturing birds how to fly. So let's say a practitioner figures out how to do something through trial and error, i.e., a bird figures out how to fly by flapping its wings. Then an academic who's in the theory of aerotime physics or whatever it is, then says, here are the mechanics behind how this bird flies. And then they discover a theory. Now, air quotes,
Mhm.
discover a theory and kind of apply it to this thing. But when you look at kind of a lot of, I suppose, historically very dominant societies, you look at the British Empire, you would look at the Roman Empire throughout history, always this very bottom up, guild oriented way of working, where it was kind of learning through working on the job and pushing it up. My father would always say, "What I learned on my own, I remember still." I love that saying. But I think it's definitely a problem in a sense where you almost don't know something truly until you
Mm.
bind it to actual lived experience, in a sense. And you know,
As you're talking, I am, and I'm agreeing with you, but I'm remembering a conversation I had with a group of teachers not very long ago, and it's the perfect example of what you're discussing, because obviously there is what you might call the basic bottom up practice of teaching, which is where you have a curriculum and you have kids in front of you and you teach them what you need to learn. But now there is a whole other layer on top of teachers in Irish society. So this group of teachers was telling me recently about an in-service day they had, where they were basically walked through all the theoretical stages of learning. And there's and as a result of that, they now have all this additional paperwork where they have to fill out lesson plans in advance. They have to survey their students at the end of every week to ask them what they have learned. They have asked that, the students have to basically rate the teachers on, have they accomplished this lesson goal or that lesson goal. And the point they were making is this all gets in the way of good teachers teaching. Maybe theoretically it holds an occasional bad teacher to account, but even if it does that, the bad teacher just stays in the post anyway. But you've got this layer of people now on top of the theorists, interfering directly in the practical applications of how to teach somebody woodwork or metalwork or drawing or English, and that's happening, I think, right across society, and you see it a lot. I think it accounts for a lot of what we call, or what people call, wokeness in society, is this huge oversupply of theorists. So, when you have an organization that is delivering cancer services to women, suddenly changing its website to, instead of saying women, start saying people with breasts, that is not something that's key to the delivery of the service, right? That is something that has, by and large, been imposed by people who have come in to advise them on inclusivity and diversity. And so when people talk about the DEI agenda, I think it's all connected to sort of the overproduction of theorists in society and the underproduction of doers, which is inextricably connected to the massive increase in the number of people we're sending through third level in Western society, with a limited return on investment, except for the constant necessitating to keep those people employed for social stability reasons. Because if they all find they're unemployable, then there's revolution, right? So to keep them employed, we have to constantly expand this theorizing, and it's, at some point it's a bit of a pyramid scheme, because at some point it's got to stop and the whole house of cards comes down, and then I think we might have a genuine sort of France in the 1770s moment.
for certain, yeah. I believe organizations have what is called as well. First of all, I think that's a fantastic formulation there as well, John. But have you heard of the concept of an embedded growth obligation?
Yes.
So, yeah, if you want to explain it to the audience, I could.
Well, we might explain it differently, but I would think of the phrase. I mentioned the show earlier in the conversation. I hope I won't be forgiven for mentioning it twice, but I think it's something everyone should watch. It's a phrase in Yes Minister, where I think it's Sir Humphrey says to the minister that it is a well-known principle that the number of social problems in an area will always expand to accommodate the number of social workers available to address them. And it is the idea essentially that, if you are I'm going to use that example of social workers. To me, it is the idea that if you have people who are doing good work, they must seek problems to address. And if they're seeking problems to address to justify your own existence, you will always find them. And so the other way I would explain it is the way that organizations that have a particular purpose can never, by definition, accomplish that purpose. So, for example, in Ireland, if you have an organization, for example, that's called the Combat Poverty Agency, what happens to that agency if it ever succeeds and poverty is abolished? It doesn't suddenly change its name to being the Keep Poverty Extinct Agency. By and large, what it does is it redefines poverty as being slightly richer than people were before, and says that there's more of it, because you have an obligation to justify your own existence. So that's how I would define it, which probably isn't in the most academic terms, but I think we're talking about the same thing.
I think so. Yeah, like when I was saying about let's say on the production side of it, so because there are almost two sides of it there. It's like that on the existential side of it, that is like part of the embedded growth obligation. There's part of keeping people moving through an organization. The organization has to grow in order to do that. So I run a business. I have a number of team members. The company, or a good a number of employees. The company has to continue growing. Like has a need to continue growing in order to give them career growth. It has to grow. But let's say in an academic sense, you have a PhD. He wants to have PhD students beneath him. Let's say he produces 20 PhD students. Well, they want to have 20 PhD students start their tenure as a PhD. This then leads to 400 PhD students one generation later. And that really clogs the upward mobility of these people. Or you look at that in a massive company, they sort of top out after a little while. Let's say a big four or kind of one of these big accountancy firms, you start to see this after a while. And I think with that kind of production of theorizers, there's this kind of exponential curve to it, almost one generation into the process where think of that a few generations out. If you extrapolate that out, it becomes pretty immense after a while. You have this huge oversupply that happens very quickly.
But yeah, look, I think that's both our interpretations. I think are both on the money, because there's this. The other thing I would add to it is sort of the changing societal expectations that come with this. There's not only PhD students wishing to produce further PhDs. There's also this increasing sort of educational floor that a PhD is now has very not dissimilar value to what an undergraduate degree would have had in, say, 1977, or what a postgraduate degree would have had in 1995. So there's this constant rising level of where the expected floor in society is. But the problem is that the level of sort of economic output hasn't risen with that floor to give. I mean, somebody with an undergraduate degree in 1977 may well have been much better off and had much greater employment prospects than somebody with a PhD in 2024. And that's the other consequence of all this.
100%. I think potentially an interesting question on the idea of practitioners, on the idea of skin in the game being a huge learning, a huge almost flow trigger in many respects, and something that forces you to have to learn something because you need to. Like, I have to learn a lot about the Irish political situation before this interview to not sound like a complete idiot speaking to you, for example. There's a time limit of, okay, this is happening at this time. I don't want to sound like a blubbering idiot, so I'd better do more research than I normally do. But
Mm.
only 1 in 5 Roman emperors died in their bed. This is a curveball now. I'm not sure if we're getting that here. Only 1 in 5 Roman emperors died in their bed, meaning the rest of them died in the battlefield. They didn't exactly die of natural causes. And it used to be a case where if you were getting this unbridled status of being the undisputed leader of a society, you had to be a warrior. This is not the cleanest analogy because of the application I'm going to bring it into. But would Conor McGregor ironically make a very good president of Ireland on the basis of he clearly loves the country. He hasn't exactly he's a complete patriot. He represents us abroad. He screams from the rooftops about how Irish he is. There's never been any kind of Bono tax scandal with Conor McGregor. He seems to pay his taxes. He exports Irish products around the world. He's a phenomenal businessman with his whiskey and his stout and his other things. I mean, that wouldn't make him a worse president.
He certainly would not be our worst president, because I think that honour is reserved to the current incumbent. People might disagree with me on that, and we could talk about that. First of all, I just want to say I'm a huge. We could talk about the Roman Empire for hours if you want to, because I think we have a shared enthusiasm for that stuff, like all men. I think with Conor McGregor, there's an interesting analogy you make to sort of the idea of the warrior president. I think that first of all, one of the things that makes Conor really, really popular overseas and kind of holds him back at home is that ironically he is the most Irish person possibly in existence in terms of how Irishness is often seen overseas. So when I spent quite not as much in recent years, but I have spent quite a bit of time, for example, in the US, and particularly when he was at his height of popularity, I was over there, and every time I was Irish, people would like they would never mention Bono, they would never mention St Patrick, they'd never mention anything. It was always, oh, Conor McGregor, he's amazing. But it was all what they always loved about him was the fighting, the drinking, the sort of bad language, the character. And I think a lot of Irish people at home have always kind of like resented that stereotype, and they kind of resent Conor a little bit because he plays into it overseas. Even though I think that is first of all just good business sense. I mean, Sheamus in the WWE, who's somebody who's a sort of less successful version of the same kind of career arc, does exactly the same thing. But I do think that holds him back a little bit here because there's a sort of a sophisticated part of the Irish electorate that likes to think of itself as superior to the rest of the world, certainly superior to our neighbours, the British, and definitely superior to those dreadful Americans. And they don't necessarily approve culturally of people who make the Americans and the British kind of feel validated in their stereotypes towards Irish people. So I think that's a challenge that Conor McGregor is going to have to think about how to overcome where he's going to politics. Where I think he has a huge advantage, though, is that it is his global appeal. He is somebody who, and Conor Fitzgerald, who's an excellent writer, wrote a piece on this before Christmas, where he said, look, Conor McGregor would have an election team not based of only Irish people, but he would have young men from Portugal and Brazil and South America and the Philippines who are living in Ireland going around to doors saying, we love this guy. He's a fantastic representative of your country. I mean, he's loved around the world. And I think there's a degree to which Irish people would like that as well. I think his difficulty will be sort of a very similar difficulty to that of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a remarkably successful politician by any stretch of the imagination. He's been president of the United States. He's also failed to win re-election, we put it like that. But he's always had this sort of Achilles heel of not knowing when to shut up. We put it that way. And I think Conor might have a little bit of that too. He's very much in that mold, and I think he has all the qualities to be an Irish Trump in that he will appeal to very much a similar swathe of people. I think he'll have huge support in working class communities. I think there are a lot of rural communities that would like him, but I think there will be a sort of a lot of people who I might call sort of the educated skeptics. You know, the people who are opposed to the current sort of state of play in Ireland, the equivalent of what in America they call never Trumpers. In other words, people like me. I'm not saying I would be a never McGregor guy, not by any stretch of the imagination. But there are a lot of people from sort of similar educational, political backgrounds to me who might find themselves having to hold their nose for him. And I think, you know, that'll be a very difficult transition thing for him to manage. So I don't know if I've answered your question or I've just waffled, but yeah, I think put it this way, it'd be very interesting to see him try.
Yeah, I think you added very interesting context there. I think for me, I'm 25 years old, so I was kind of growing up in that era where Conor was just absolutely blowing up, you know, and going on an incredible run. And I also was still training at the time. Now I just do jujitsu, but I was you know training away at the time, and he got me into all of that. And there's just an affinity to him that I have that will never go away. Even when I go abroad and I tell someone that I'm Irish and my name is Conor, instantly Conor McGregor is the first thing everyone says, regardless of where they're from. Down in Argentina,
It happened to me. It happened to me in Rome and in Prague in the last year. Two cities, obviously both in Europe, but both cases. I'm in a restaurant, and waiters, when they realize you're not local, nearly always ask you where you're from. And the moment you say they're Irish, and the two completely different countries, both of them, first thing they said was, "Oh, Conor McGregor, amazing!" And that has happened in almost every country I've been to for the last decade. And I'm not an MMA fan at all. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to like the aforementioned pro wrestling, but I never really. I think because its rise coincided with the point in my career when I was youngest and busiest, and I never really had time to get into it. But like you know, he made it. He has made such an impact that it's impossible to go anywhere in the world without his name being known. I think he's the Pope even as well known. It's incredible.
100%. Yeah, no, he's certainly skyrocketed past Bono. I would say is the most famous Irish person really alive at the minute, and I think there with maybe some of the ridicule we'd seen was it. I think I'd read an article, maybe it was at Eilish O'Hanlon or someone like this who had written it about Conor, where basically saying the ridicule he was getting was sort of that this plucky kind of nouveau riche kind of guy who's come through the ranks, who doesn't have the rules of, let's say that kind of Killiney club sort
Mm,
of almost don't know if I'm fully correct here to say, but that kind of almost old IRA then leads into RTE kind of
mm.
class, if you get me, the Tuberty kind of class, where he's kind of going into that, and he doesn't get the rules. He just goes in and he blasts in the way that he knows, the way that he normally does, kind of rocks up to the place, and the ridicule was kind of, kind of a snooty sort of a thing that he got. But I think there is clearly appetite for kind of a bit of McGregor leadership there, from kind of some of the reaction we're seeing on Twitter.
Well, there's you see, I don't know about the presidency, because the thing with the presidency is you need to win 51% of the vote. That's a tall order. But I think if Conor were to announce that he was going to stand for the European Parliament, for example, tomorrow, or stand for the Oireachtas, stand for the Dáil tomorrow, I think he would walk into a seat, because there, 20% wins you the election. And I think he would have that at a canter. I found what you're saying about the sort of class-based snobbery very interesting, because this is another way Ireland, I always think, is a fascinating society. We're very proud that we're a republic, and we're very proud that we got rid of all the aristocracy and the sirs and the lords and the ladies, but we still have our own aristocracy. That, what you're talking about, that sort of old money South Dublin establishment, very much exists, and the bloodlines go back generations. And I'm friends with some of these people, so I won't name all the families. You named Tuberty. The Andrews family is definitely one such family, but there are hundreds of them across South Dublin, and indeed in other parts of the country as well. I mean, there's political dynasties going back generations. There's a sort of Irish, which you might call unlanded, or certainly unnobled aristocracy that's there. Um, and there's a protective shield around it, and there's also an instinctive snobbery. And I think people watching from one of the things about um, I always find fascinating is accents. I find accents fascinating, because I think a lot of Irish people can't necessarily distinguish between somebody from Wisconsin and somebody from Arkansas. Right? Maybe they could if they listened for a little while, but they find it very difficult. And similarly, American people I found struggle to. I remember talking to an American who playing a recording of somebody from Belfast and somebody from Kerry, and he only detected the very smallest difference. So I think internationally people don't realize that Connor has a very working class Dublin accent, and there is huge snobbery in Ireland towards that accent. And it's one of the things we don't talk about. There's huge snobbery in Ireland towards that accent, and I think it's very much the case that there's huge snobbery towards that accent in sort of the upper middle classes of society, and I think that's very unfortunate, and something that we have to wrestle with as a country. And I think his best bet there would be to challenge it head on and say, look, people with me like this accent have been traditionally underrepresented in Irish society, because they have been, and it's time for and embrace it. So I think that's those are some of the huge challenges that somebody looking from overseas mightn't appreciate. But it's real, and there's no point not talking about it openly. I think it's something that's worth talking about openly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, but quite openly, he would have my vote. Absolutely. I think anyone of my age
Mm.
demographic, he'd certainly have their vote.
I,
So yeah.
Oh, as I say, I mean, I think he would have no difficulty getting to 25, 30% of the vote. It's for the presidency specifically, which is what you asked me about, where you kind of need to get over the 50% threshold. I think that for the moment might be a bridge too far. But I also think it would be a mistake for Conor to run for president, because the presidency is a golden cage. Michael D. Higgins, who is the current president, has the ability to speak out and say the things that he says, because he is allowed to by the government, because he is tolerated. And I think where Conor McGregor has become the president and try to use the presidency in that same way, that a lot of people who tolerated what the current president is doing would suddenly find it within themselves to start worrying about the constitutional limitations on the presidency, and how he must be above politics, and how he can't say these things, and how if he continues to say these things, well, we'll have no option but to impeach him and remove him from office. And I think Conor might find the presidency to be a little bit of a golden cage, with a lot of shaking of hands, and a lot. I mean, for example, a lot of people won't know that the president of Ireland actually cannot leave the island of Ireland without the official consent of the government. So I mean, that's what I say when I mean it can be used as a golden cage too. So I think he would shake the system up much more if he wants to go down that road. If I was him, I would stand for the European Parliament elections this year in Dublin, where I think he would take a seat. And I think the European Parliament is a place where you have, first of all, you have a continental wide voice, but second of all, you have a platform then to use that position to build something national, and to build a movement of people who support you, and actually enter government. potentially in a couple of years. So that's, if I was advising Conor, and I'm very much not, that's what I would be saying to him. So that's just my honest opinion. I think he's great, and I think he has, you know, obviously we have to mention that there have been some legal issues over recent years, but you know, and I think that, and I think in politics those will be brought up, particularly the incident with an older man in a bar, I think. But I think, notwithstanding those things, I think he could get past them, and I think he would. You're living proof that there are a lot of young people out there who will be lining up to back him.
100%. John, I don't want to keep you here too much longer. I know you're a busy man. Anything else we should be on the lookout for in 2024 on the horizon? Anything interesting you think might be coming up that we should keep our eyes on?
I think obviously it's going to be a huge year internationally. I think the European elections are going to be very interesting, because a lot of the issues that we're facing here in Ireland are actually common across the continent, because you know, we have a lot of sort of governments that are under pressure. I saw an opinion poll this week that shows the German Alliance for Democracy, the AfD, which is, I mean, I would call it a far right party. It's a very nationalist. It's a very sort of 1930s esque, maybe without the anti-Semitism party, is now on 18% of the vote. You've got a French presidential election in a couple of years where Macron, who's been sort of the glue holding France together because he's just taken enough votes from the centre, he won't be there anymore. You've got big elections this year in a whole raft of countries across Europe, and then European elections as well. I think, you know, it could be a very tumultuous year, and add to that the fact that you've got these ongoing wars. I don't think there's any prospect for the war in Ukraine ending in 2024, barring a complete military collapse by one side or the other, which I think you'd be silly to bet on that. And then the situation in Gaza. So you're going to have more pressure on sort of energy prices, more migration, you know, all of these things. Add that into a political cocktail in Europe that is becoming more and more explosive. At some point, I think that, you know, there's going to be an earthquake. Put it that way. I don't know whether it'll be this year, but you know, this year might be a year when that cocktail becomes even more explosive.
I would definitely be massively inclined to agree. I suppose final thing, John, where would you direct people to find you? Your Twitter, you've grown quite a big following on Gript.ie, of course. I would highly recommend anyone listening to definitely check out Gript, support Gript, because it's independent journalism, and it's a really, really fantastic resource for anyone in Ireland in particular. But where would you direct people to follow?
Yeah, that just I'm on Twitter at John_McGuirk. I mean, I actually I don't have many social media platforms, because I just find that, you know, having one place where people can find you is good. So I'm obviously I'm the editor of Gript.ie. You can read my work there, and then at Twitter on John_McGuirk, and then I actually do a weekly podcast of my own. It's audio only, but it's out on Fridays as well with a very good friend called Sarah Ryan. So you can tune in there if you want to hear my opinions. But you're very lucky, Conor. I'm generally very opposed to doing things on video, so I made an exception and came on the webcam today.
Absolutely, not a bother, and thanks very much. I'm very glad you did, John. Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And
Take care.
yeah.